All right. Well, again, everyone, thank you for joining this afternoon and welcome. This is the onboarding webinar for the Improving Neighborhood Outcomes in Disproportionately Impacted Communities, or as you may hear me refer to it today, INODIC. We will move forward. I am your presenter today. My name is Chase Jones. I'm with the Governor's Office of Planning and Budget as a grants planner. We are also joined today by the OPB Grants Division Director, Jen Wade, as well as Amanda Hawkins, who is also an OPB grants planner. We also have with us from RSM, our auditing partner, Megan Power, as well as I believe David Luker, hopefully is with us as well. Thank you all for being here today. All right, well, we'll cover a detailed overview of the INODIC grant today. I'd like to go ahead and kind of make you aware that we do have a variety of resources for FAQs on OPB's website for grantees. Today's webinar, along with the presentation slides, for those of you who were just joining, again, will be posted later on our website, and you should find it helpful throughout the remainder of the onboarding process. Our FAQ page is linked here in the slide. And again, this FAQs page will cover a variety of topics that we'll touch on today, such as 2 CFR 200, payment request, and reporting guidance. Other reference documents, guides, and how-to webinars exist on the website as well to help answer lots of other questions that you may encounter as you're working through the onboarding process. Here's a general outline for today's webinar. We'll address each of the following in the order shown. Our first item is going to be an overview of the program purpose and origin. The next is going to be a review of the federal requirements that accompany accepting the grant funds for this program. We'll then explore the next steps in the award process, including the signing of your terms and conditions, setting up of grant portal access, completion of a required vendor management form and W-9, so we can set up your banking information for direct deposit payments. Final budget approval is the final step. Following that, we'll touch on completing the necessary environmental reviews, if applicable, for your project, and which we'll touch on a little bit more. Then we'll look at the process for reimbursement submissions. So you've been awarded a award. How do you now draw down that money? We'll cover all that in good detail. Then we'll move on to reviewing Treasury reporting requirements that are associated with acceptance of these funds. And finally, our auditing partners from RSM will review the audit expectations for the program, as well as just some general best practices I know for procurement that we'll touch on again as well. All right, here are some very kind of more specific goals to keep in mind during today's onboarding webinar. Some key takeaways we hope that you'll come away with. I want you to develop through this webinar kind of a familiarity with each of these items moving forward in the grant process. And these goals are going to include recognizing your organization's responsibility to comply with federal requirements attached to the grant funding and award. Identifying the next steps in the award process, and I identified those 4 a moment ago. Identifying the key grant documents used in the next steps, payment request process in the future, and in other grant areas for the program. And then familiarizing yourself with available grant resources. Again, we've taken a lot of time in developing some resources on the website for you to rely on, and we want you to make good use of those. And finally, kind of piggybacking on the first item here, we want you to understand your audit requirements specifically for the program and want you to be aware of the resources to help you with those audits. Okay, well, let's go ahead and dive into kind of an overview of the INO DIC program and its kind of purpose and origin. INO DIC grant program is funded through the American Rescue Plan Act of 2001. These funds were provided to alleviate the negative economic and health effects from the COVID-19 pandemic. This funding stream is separate and unique from some of the other COVID-19 relief funds you may be familiar with, such as those provided earlier through the CARES Act. The performance period for this grant is going to begin once you have signed your terms and conditions agreement. Those were emailed out yesterday, so they should be in your inbox. It will come from an Adobe Sign origination point, and we'll discuss that in detail later a little bit more. The performance period is going to end on October 31st of 2026. That, of course, would be the period at which all of your requests for grant fundings have been received by OPB, and we would be liquidating the grant program at that point. And you would no longer be able to submit for requests for payments beyond that. The grant program is structured so that your organization is a subrecipient of grant funds. Our office OPB is the primary recipient of the grant for the state, as the state. And this is going to be helpful to know just when you are reading through any of the federal program language and guidance publications to understand your role as a subrecipient. The INO DIC grant program maximum allowable request, as you're probably familiar, was $2 million. It's capped at $2 million in funding. However, if you would note that we've got 2.2 million listed in parentheses here, this is going to be to reflect that we are, or the governor has generously allowed a 10% additional contingency fund for awardees in this program. Those are going to be to cover eligible cost covered or as approved for cost overruns for your respective projects. The 10% contingency fund will require additional written narratives and submissions to draw down and supporting documentation to demonstrate the cost overruns experienced by your program, whether those were due to material variances, labor variances, or other unforeseen issues your project may have encountered. At the bottom on this slide, I've also gone ahead and linked a link for the INO DIC program page on the OPB website. This is one more important page that you'll want to bookmark for quick reference and access for a lot of these materials seen here. Moving on, our program overview. So the Treasury final rule governing state and local fiscal recovery funds recognized that investments in neighborhood features, including parks, recreation facilities, sidewalks, healthy food access, can and work to improve physical and mental health outcomes. This was the rationale we relied on when developing the INO DIC program for the state. Additionally, final rule recognized that pre-existing health, economic, and social disparities contributed to disproportionate in certain communities and allowed for a broader list of enumerated eligible uses to respond to the pandemic in disproportionately impacted communities. And under final rule, recipients were allowed to presume the families residing in QCTs or receiving services were disproportionately impacted by the pandemic. This was the rationale for the program requirement that your project be located physically within a qualifying QCT. And from the initial kind of broad language that I spoke to, that Treasury used, Georgia's INO-DIC program was developed with two narrowed categories for eligible use. Those are both listed here. The first is development of or improvements to maintenance of parks or recreational facilities in a qualified census tract in Georgia. And the second eligible category for funding was the repair or for increased repair or maintenance needs to respond to significantly greater use of public facilities during the pandemic. So your project should correspond to the category description within which you applied and were awarded. Moving on from our general overview, we're going to discuss some of the specific policy requirements now attached to these grant funds. 2 CFR 200 refers to Title II, Subtitle A, Chapter 2, Part 200 of the Code of Federal Regulations. This is the code section that provides uniform guidance for administrative requirements, cost principles, audit requirements, and for federal awards. These policy requirements are applicable to the grant funds you've been awarded, and this includes, but is not limited to, single audits, competitive procurement, among others that we will highlight here in this webinar. Subrecipients should read through these requirements thoroughly to gain an understanding of what is required of your organization through these grant fundings. Beyond the policy requirements here of 2 CFR 200, any project whose total cost requirements exceed greater than $10 million must also conform to policy requirements of the Davis-Bacon Act. And the Davis-Bacon Act addresses requires a certification that for all relevant project, all laborers, mechanics employed by contractors and subcontractors in the performance of the project are paid wages at rates not less than those of the prevailing area as determined by the U.S. Secretary of Labor. Our post-award FAQs, which is linked multiple times again on slides throughout the slideshow here, contain additional reference materials for guidance on both 2 CFR 200 and Davis-Bacon. Moving on for the policy requirements, further under uniform guidance, recipients of SFRF funding must use documented procedures, or procurement procedures, excuse me, specifically, which conform to applicable federal law and procurement standards covered in 2 CFR 200, sections 200.317 through 200.326, and procedures which echo applicable state and local laws and regulations. The following subparts here are applicable to your responsibilities, and we would like to go ahead and highlight this afternoon subparts D and F. All subparts are important, however, these two we get the most frequent questions about, and as noted at the bottom of the slide, additional requirements may be placed on your award as outlined in your executed terms and conditions agreement when you accept the award. So please be aware of that. A little too fast there. Subpart D, Subpart D, again, is going to relate to all requirements in procurement within your project. They're listed. I won't go through each of these individually, but you can see the way that the code breaks out the procurement procedures. Subpart D, procurement, again. So recipients are responsible for ensuring that any procurement using SLFRF funds or payments under procurement contracts using such funds are consistent with the procurement standards set forth in the Uniform Guidance at 2 CFR 200.317 through 2 CFR 200.327. As applicable, 2 CFR 200.317 states that the non-federal entity must maintain records sufficient to detail the history of procurement. These records will include, but are not necessarily limited to, the following: rationale for the method of procurement, selection of contract type, contractor selection or rejection, and the basis for the contract price. Continuing on for subpart D, procurement. The Uniform Guidance establishes in 2 CFR 200.319 that all procurement transactions for property or services must be conducted in a manner providing full and open competition, consistent with standards outlined in 2 CFR 200.320, which allows for non-competitive procurements only in circumstances where at least one of the following conditions is true. Those are the item is below a micro purchase threshold, or the item is available only from a single source, or the public exigency or emergency will not permit a delay from publicizing a competitive solicitation, or after solicitation of a number of sources or competition is determined to be inadequate. So that would be a rarity in most cases that we would find one of those issues arising. Subpart D, procurement, continued here. Recipients must have and use documented procedures, procurement procedures that are consistent with the standards set forth in 2 CFR 200, 3.17 through 2 CFR 200, 3.20. The Uniform Guidance requires an infrastructure for competitive bidding and contractor oversight, including maintaining written standards of conduct and prohibitions on dealing with suspended or disembarred parties. Your organization must ensure adherence to all applicable local, state, and federal procurement laws and regulations. And a couple of links here to help further understanding of the procurement requirements. We have a link for you to the Treasury Compliance Reporting Guidance, as well as our own developed OPB guide on procurement. I just want to emphasize real quick again that understanding your requirements is your organization's responsibility, and ultimately a failure to understand and comply with them would result in an ineligibility to receive reimbursement through the grant program if they were not adhered to strictly. Here we've developed and provided for you a charted breakdown of the 5 different procurement methods addressed in 2 CFR 200. For some of you that aren't as familiar with federal grant funding and working with it, this hopefully may make it a little less intimidating in kind of getting a footing and understanding of how those procurement requirements look and operate. And as you can see, they are generally based on a purchase amount threshold amongst the varying procurement methods given. All right, moving on from subpart F to our subpart D to subpart F, which is going to be the audit requirements for grantees. 2 CFR 200 subpart F establishes requirements and applicability of audits for the grant program. Audits are an important part of ensuring compliance and discouraging instances of fraud, waste, and abuse of funding. We would strongly encourage you again to review each of the subparts in totality. And I want to highlight item A and D quickly for you. Item A under the audits is going to be in subpart F here. Audit required for a non-federal entity that expends $750,000 or more during the non-federal entity fiscal year. In federal award, must have a single or program-specific audit conducted for that year in accordance with the provision of this part. And highlighting item D, exemption when federal awards expended are less than $750,000. Non-federal entity that expends less than $750,000 during the non-federal entity's fiscal year in federal award is exempt from federal audit requirements for that year, except as noted in 2 CFR 200.503 relation to or audit requirements, but records must be available for review or audit by appropriate officials of the federal agency pass-through entity and the Government Accountability Office. All that to say that even if your grant spending does not exceed the $750,000 threshold, you are required to maintain a paper trail of documentation that can be reviewed and audited per the federal guidance. Some more on subpart F or audit requirements. I'll point out that in item F under subpart F, it addresses instances where you as a subrecipient may also simultaneously be a contractor for the project and addresses kind of any or helps develop some understanding if you see that conflict arise for your project. Furthermore, on item G, we've highlighted that while an auditee must ensure compliance with contractor selection, i.e. procurement policy of 2 CFR 200, they must also ensure that contractors remain in compliance with all policy requirements if contractors are structured in a manner to be responsible for program compliance. So RSM will speak more to the audit process later, but we wanted to note this subsection is where you can find kind of the originating code for your responsibilities for audits and compliance for the grant. All right, moving forward, let's look at the next steps in the onboarding process. So we've provided here a screenshot of next steps on our 4 grantees section of our website. And we're going to review each of these 4 next steps in a little more detail next. We've also included a link here for the 4 grantees page for your reference later. Onboarding step 1, that is going to be for signing the grant terms and conditions agreement. As I mentioned, your terms and conditions agreement were emailed out yesterday from the Adobe Sign origination email. If you've not seen that yet in your inbox, please do look through any spam or junk folders you have. They do tend to get caught through your email filters in those folders. The link provided on the slide will take you to the OPB grantees page where you can see again the onboarding steps listed sequentially with links to help for each step. And I will note that for many of you as the POC for the grant application, you'll receive this email to sign the terms and conditions. However, you may not be your organization's authorized signatory for the terms and conditions agreement. So, but we do have a way to delegate those terms and conditions to that signatory within your organization, and we will review that process next. So how to delegate the terms and conditions agreement. This is a screenshot of the terms and conditions email applicants should have received at this point. At the bottom of the screenshot, you will see a link, a hyperlink within the word delegate. So if you do need to delegate this to another individual in your organization, you will select the link to delegate. And as the bolded language in front of delegate connotates, we would ask that you please do not forward this email on to anyone else. Follow this process to avoid any hangups in the delegation process. If the email is forwarded, ultimately it affects our ability to track the signature, and it can affect the recipient's ability to sign once they have received it. So moving on, once you've selected the option to delegate here, you will see the screen presented here on this slide, and you'll fill in the appropriate information of the person you are delegating the signature to, and select to click the delegate button once you've filled in all of the appropriate information. And Adobe Sign at that point will send over a request for signature to the person you were delegating to. To kind of further assist in this process, as it does happen frequently, we also have developed a short tutorial video available on our website within our webinar and video section on a very step-by-step visual how to delegate terms and conditions. So please feel free to make use of that as needed. Okay, so moving on to our next step after terms and conditions have been signed. Awardees will receive, or it's going to be for activating your Georgia Grants portal for access. So awardees will receive an email from the OPB Grants Management System, which we call Grant Care or the Georgia Grants portal, to facilitate account setup and award management. This email will go to the point of contact listed on the awardee application. So again, if you've not seen that, look through your spam and junk folders. The Georgia Grants portal user guide with instructions on adding additional users can be found under the important documents section of our For Grantees website. And we have linked that portal user guide on the slide below. You may find it helpful to add additional users within the Grant Care portal to aid in situations where you may have people out of the office and need backup assistance in covering grant-related issues. Additionally, you as the primary port of contact for your organization may not be the one handling the financial payment request submissions. And ultimately, you may decide that it's easier to have whomever that is within your organization submit those for the organization in the portal themselves. And in that case, you could provide them or add them as an authorized user to the portal. And we will touch a little bit more on how to do the additions to the portal later in today's meeting. Just another note that once you have gained access to your portal, you may not see just yet your award under the My Grants tab until all onboarding steps have been completed for the grant. It will not show up until all onboarding steps have been completed. Until that time, you would also see under your My Grants or My Applications the accepted status showing. So just be aware of that in case you do get access and are kind of wondering where your award should show up. All right, moving forward to step 3, which is going to be our vendor management form. To facilitate payments to you, our grantees or awardees. Awardees must be registered as a vendor with the state and provide information to accept electronic ACH payments in order, to receive your reimbursement within the grant. Awardees must submit both a vendor management form and W-9 via SurveyMonkey Apply, providing information to accept, electronic ACH payments. This must be completed within 60 days of the initial award notice, which would put us on a timeline that must be completed by July the 18th would be the day, since award notices went out on May the 18th. Instructions for this process were included on your initial award notification email. So you can refer back to that for these steps as well. Some more information on our vendor management form and W-9 collection process. If your organization has completed these forms previously for different programs, grant programs, that is, you must still complete these forms to ensure correct banking information is utilized for this program and its payments. Please note that the state accounting office processes these forms, and historically they have taken multiple weeks to process these forms. We have worked with them diligently to try to shorten that window. However, we cannot make guarantees. Therefore, we encourage all awardees to submit these forms in completed form as soon as possible. And again, we have a link below on the slide for more information on the vendor management form, should you have additional questions. Moving on to our fourth and final final step for onboarding, we have our final budget submission. So I know most of you have submitted through the application process and follow-up task one or more budgets already. However, the final onboarding step here is another final budget submission. So before submitting, before being able to submit for reimbursement request, you must submit a final detailed budget worksheet that is a budget specific for your project. These should be sent to the assigned programmatic grant specialist for review and approval. For our INO-DIC program, the program specialist is Russell O'Hare's with RM or RSM. His contact is provided here, and that is where you email your final budget for your final approval. Grantees will receive final approval through the Georgia Grants portal once their final budget has been reviewed and approved by the grants specialist. A little more on the final budget. Below are a couple of links to the final budget worksheet and a budget worksheet guide. They are also, of course, on our website for grantees in the For Grantees section under important documents. a little bit more here on final budgets. Final budgets should contain OPB, State Fiscal Recovery Fund grant amount, excuse me. So final budget should contain OPB, State Fiscal Recovery Funds only. Related project cost covered by outside funding or match funds should not be included on your final budget. We emphasize this as a lot of you through the application process and follow-up task still included outside funding on that project budget. So we need to make sure that gets cleaned up. Contract services are subject to CFR 200 procurement requirements. And as such, these contracts and et cetera do not align with federal guidance. Anything that does not fit within the 2 CFR 200 requirements, please do not include those on your final budget submission to OPB. Fund sources outside of the ARPA fund award should follow any requirements or restrictions for those fund source or award sources that they came from. I'll mention contingency budgets again. We touched on that earlier. So we will add a 10% contingency budget for each project. Please include this on your final budget submission as a line item in the other category, simply labeled contingency budget. Okay, so again, your final fourth onboarding step was a final budget for approval. Let me touch on real quick, though, the process for budget revision and change of scope. Both of these processes would occur after your final budget has been approved. So let's say that you had begun working on a project and a number of the items that we'll discuss here come up. This is a process for both budget revision and change of scope for the project should they become necessary. So basically, if a circumstances arises after approval of your final project budget, necessitating changes to the budget between categories, this is the budget adjustment process. Budget adjustments are used to modify an approved budget to reallocate funds among the budget categories. I will emphasize that this is not a process to increase in any way the amount of your total award that's been given. A budget modification can only be initiated again once an awardee has final clearance on their initial approved budget. Some instances that a budget adjustment must be initiated. So if the proposed cumulative change to the budget is greater than 10% of the total award amount, then there must be a budget revision is required. This 10% rule does not apply if the award is less than $100,000. The proposed change, or another instance that will require a budget revision, would be if there's proposed change within any budget category that is greater than 10% of the original category total. Additionally, if a budget modification changes the scope of a project in some way, and that scope requirement would require submission of a budget adjustment. Some examples of this would include altering the purpose of a project, authorizing use of a subcontractor or other organization that might not have been identified on the initial project budget or contracting for transferring of award supported efforts, if those were moved to another entity. And another instance in which a budget adjustment might be necessary is if a budget or an adjustment would affect an eligible cost category that was not included in the original budget document. For example, if within your project you had initially not proposed category spending on contractors or contracts, you would need to submit a budget adjustment in order to have the ability to make payments on contracts. All right, kind of moving from budget revision to change of scope, when and why a change of scope might be necessary. So a scope change should only be submitted again after a final budget has been submitted and approved. Your grant was awarded based on the components of your original application, so any change to that project scope will require a thorough review on our behalf. Some reasons, though, that a scope change might be acceptable and you might submit for one would be changes to the objectives, aims, or purposes for your project, transfer of the performance of a substantial portion of the programmatic body of work to another entity, or budget revision that would cause a project to change substantially from that which was originally approved. Okay, moving on, I will allow our friend Megan Powers from our auditing partner RSM to touch on some of the environmental review and historic preservation aspects as they affect the program.
Thank you, Chase. So just a few quick points on environmental review and historic preservation. For those of you who are familiar with some of OPB's other grant programs, similar to those programs, the National Historic Preservation Act does not apply to this grant funding. However, if your project has additional federal involvement or funding beyond the INO-DIC's SLFRF funding, you'll need to consult with DCA's Historic Preservation Division to make sure that you understand the requirements that are specific to your project. But otherwise, if your project is solely funded by this grant alone, it will not apply. And then for further environmental considerations, so for the Parks and Recreation construction projects that disturb 1 or more acres, these projects require coverage under one of the 3 NPDES construction general permits. And further with that, if the project is within a jurisdiction that has been certified by EPD as a local issuing authority, those same projects will require a local land disturbance permit. But if the project disturbing 1 or more acres is exempt from the LIA's ordinance or is not within an LIA jurisdiction, the ESPCP must be submitted to EPD for review. Again, the requirements for every project are going to be slightly different. These are certainly a starting point, but for any questions that you have or for further contact information, there is a link at the bottom of this slide that you can reach out to EPD to have further conversations that are specific to your project.
Thank you, Megan.
Of course.
Okay, moving on to some of the more exciting content about how you can draw down your award money. Payment requests. Payment request, once your project has incurred eligible expenses for reimbursement, a request must be submitted in the Grant Care portal. This is assuming that you've completed all for the onboarding steps we've just covered. And again, the Grant Care portal is available or the login link is on OPB's homepage. In the Grant Care portal, you'll be required to enter some descriptive data for each payment request, as well as upload your completed payment template and supporting documentation for that payment request. Your supporting documentation for a payment request will vary depending on the item or items that you're seeking reimbursement for. It may include timesheets and payroll for labor expenses, or contracts and invoices from contractors for payments to contractors and consultants, just as an example. The instructions are provided on the payment request template are very detailed and cover what is expected for documentation in each cost category. And we do also have supporting documentation and quick guides for reference linked on this slide to assist you in creating your payment request. A little more on the payment request process. Once the payment request is successfully submitted in the Grant Care portal, it will be assigned to a reviewer who will ensure all needed documentation is included and that the expense is eligible to be refunded within the program terms and conditions per your approved final budget. If any errors or omissions are found, the payment request will be returned to you for revision with specific notes on what issues were found. Grantees can monitor and track the status of their payment request in Grant Care. And through that review process, there's a number of stages that include review and process, decision and process, approved, return for revision, payment processing, and payment complete or rejection. Those are all stages that are possible within the review process. Other items kind of for consideration, funds will only, or once they are to be dispersed and once a payment is received approval, funds will be dispersed through the bank account listed on your vendor management forms that were referenced earlier, that were submitted to SAO. If a change in your banking information is required for some reason, if you change banks or accounts that you want to receive these grant funds to, you will need to work with your grant specialist in our office to make us aware so that we can get an updated vendor management form and modify that banking account for you. The timing of payments is highly dependent upon a number of factors, primarily first providing correct banking information for us in the vendor management form process. Of course, you're signing terms and conditions so that we can release a payment or do a payment, and then providing complete and thorough documentation on the payment request is possibly the largest item, making sure that all items needed are submitted with that payment request so that there are minimal returns for revisions. Additionally, I'll point out we do have a link to our how to submit a payment request video on this slide. Please, if you have not done one of these payment requests before, take the time to review this video. It provides a great amount of detail and hypotheticals and examples within it that you may encounter when attempting your first payment request submission. This is just a good screenshot of what the payment request template looks like on the face of it, one of the tabs. Again, if you'll look on the two first green tabs, those are the instruction tabs that we would ask that you read over in detail for instructions on how to appropriately fill out the payment request template. I will note for you too that with correct documentation, we might expect payment requests to be processed within about 30 days. And any payment request that has deficiencies and is returned for revision, we will ultimately reject if we have not received those revisions within a 2-week time frame. And it will have to be resubmitted as a new payment request at that point. Okay, moving on from the payment request, we want to take a moment just to touch on point of contact and authorized users and how to update those in both of the online platforms that grantees will utilize. The first is the grants portal or grant care, as we've referenced it. There are two ways in which a point of contact for or authorized user can be changed in grant care. The first is that the initial authorized user can add or update authorized additional users in the grant care system so that an existing point of contact can then be changed out from primary if needed or throughout the process. There is a guide for changing out the authorized users linked as in the portal user guide, as linked below there. And the second method in which a new point of contact can complete the request online is by completing an authorized user designation survey, which is really an online form available in SurveyMonkey Apply. The link to this is on our website under important documents and linked here in item 2. Please note that the second option does require a signature form from an authorized official within the requester's organization. And because of that, it would need to be on appropriate letterhead for us to validate. And this process can take up to 2 weeks to process. So definitely option 1 is the more efficient way to do a point of contact change or adding of additional authorized users to your grant care portal. The second platform that grantees will utilize is our SurveyMonkey Apply platform, which we utilize primarily for both the initial application intake and also once you have been awarded a grant, we utilize it currently for collecting necessary data for reporting requirements. These are typically your quarterly reporting requirements, which we'll touch on in a little bit. SMA primary contacts are referred to in SurveyMonkey Apply as application owners, and application owner by default is the application submitter for your organization. They have the ability within SurveyMonkey Apply to add additional authorized users, which are referred to as collaborators within SurveyMonkey Apply. I will note, because this does come up frequently when quarterly reporting time comes around, that only an application owner can submit a task assigned within SurveyMonkey Apply. Even if a authorized collaborator has access within SurveyMonkey Apply, they can only fill out the data fields within the task, but they cannot ultimately send the final submission for the task once it is completed. Moving on, I just mentioned that there is reporting requirements for the grant program. OPB will collect information from awardees as part of their reporting requirements outlined by Treasury in the Compliance and Reporting Guide and in the Terms and Conditions Agreement that you have been sent between OPB and the grantee. The current Treasury guidance is located here at the link provided for reference, should you have additional questions about that. Additional notes on reporting. Grantees must complete the mandatory reporting surveys for the following quarters in order to fulfill the reporting requirements placed upon the state of Georgia from the Department of Treasury. Awardees should prepare for these reports after signing the terms and conditions to ensure that information is available for us for timely reporting to Treasury, and that is going to be due typically by the 15th of each month following a calendar or a quarter of the calendar year. And you can see those listed below. Again, these are currently this data is currently collected through SurveyMonkey Apply, and you will see a task assigned and receive notification emails when those are coming due. One final slide here for reporting. Failure to complete the mandatory reporting will result in an administrative hold for noncompliance on your account. Please don't let this happen. During a period of noncompliance, you will be unable to receive reimbursements for any pending or future payment request until the survey is complete or we receive approval on your pending budget or amendment. OPB will note each time your organization is placed under non-compliance status, and repeated failure to comply will result in further enforcement actions as necessary for non-compliance. And we have linked again, not the compliance or reporting guide for your convenience. One other item on reporting: all grantees were required to get and have an active SAMS number for their application. We do require and need for you to keep that SAMS number active throughout the performance period of the grant. And I believe you can simply do this with an annual registration on the SAMS website, and you should be receiving notifications when that is coming due. Okay, moving forward, I'm going to hand it back over to Megan for some additional comments regarding the auditing expectations and best practices with audits.
Thank you. So to provide a brief overview of RSM and our role in working with OPB, we've been engaged by the state to provide both risk assessment and grant monitoring service related to these funds. So this includes subrecipients, sub-subrecipients, vendors, suppliers, you name it, anyone who is in receipt of these SLFRF funds. This is something that our national public sector team does for multiple states across the country. So while we know that the federal requirements may seem a little daunting and overwhelming at the time, this is something we deal with on a daily basis. And so we're here to help guide and answer questions that may arise along the way. OPB has provided a lot of really great resources in this slide, so I highly encourage reviewing these, after this webinar is over and taking the time to go through everything that's been provided. It's certainly helpful. But further in our role, we're going to be involved in several components. You'll get to know us really well. We'll be helping with the detailed budget reviews that Chase mentioned, as well as the payment requests that will come forward after your budgets have been approved. RSM will also be performing monitoring activities in the form of both interim and closeout audits for these projects. It may involve items such as interviewing key personnel, performing site visits, confirming that required permits have been obtained, that you're maintaining compliance with Davis-Bacon, prevailing wage, or any other environmental requirements that are out there. The primary purpose and objective of our monitoring effort is to prevent, detect, and deter fraud. We'll ask questions that might seem uncomfortable at times. However, we like to give the opportunity for individuals to disclose of any known fraudulent acts or concerns that there may be on the project, in addition to the resources that have been provided by the state. Chase, if you don't mind going next slide, please. Okay, so starting with budgets, as Chase mentioned, a detailed budget will need to be submitted that should contain information at the low or the highest level of detail available to you at the time. And so what we do with those budgets is we perform a cost reasonableness analysis. And so during our analysis, we may come back requiring additional information, whether it be because the budgets do not have enough detail to truly, get a comfort around whether they're reasonable in nature, or maybe because we did an analysis and we think a component of the budget is high, and working through what that looks like and getting to a point where both it's feasible on your end, but also reasonable in terms of price. So that will be coming up shortly after the signing of the terms and conditions. That will also give us, from a monitoring perspective, a monitoring compliance standpoint, it'll allow us to track budget to actual. And so when payment requests come in, we're going to be able to see whether it's our way of assessing reasonableness in terms of cost. It's one component of that. Procurement and the payment requests. So generally, we want to highlight the documentation that is expected to be included with each payment request. I know Chase mentioned a few times 2 CFR 200 and how it provides multiple options on how to procure based on the size of the contract that you're looking to procure. Pursuant to that end, we will be requesting procurement documentation that may include, but is certainly not limited to, solicitations evidencing the opportunity was publicly advertised where necessary, copies of bids received, evaluations of those bids received, scoring rubrics that were advertised with the opportunities, purchase orders or contracts that result from the bids. We request really a lot. We really want to understand the procurement process, and I truly can't stress enough how important it is to understand 2 CFR 200 and the procurement requirements that come with it. The other thing I'd like to note too is just because your budget has been approved, that does not approve procurement. So please don't, have that in your head that the approved budget means you're good to go and you can go ahead and procure in any method you wish. It's been a confusion point in the past, so I just wanted to make that clear. You'll also see in the third or fourth bullet point down, Appendix 2. 2 CFR 200 Appendix 2 contains a specific set of contractual provisions that the federal government requires contractors include in their agreements. It outlines things like Davis-Bacon and fair labor standards that is required for all federal contracts. So if we get to do a payment review and those terms are not in the payment review, it's something that could come up in our monitoring process as a observation. So we really would like to address it now, and hopefully those can be included within the original contracts. If not, then hopefully contracts can be amended to include them. But I recommend spending time looking at that now to make sure you get that on the front end. After procurement, there's still quite a bit of documentation for the payment process. We'll request items such as invoice, payment support. Please note payment support is not considered screenshots from your internal systems accounts payable system. It should be an external document such as a bank statement or a cleared and canceled check front and back so that we can see that the funds were actually incurred and remitted from your account. For labor, items such as payroll registers, timesheets, activity logs, payment support that you in fact paid the employees, and as well as any policies and procedures for procurement, conflicts of interest, and payroll policies will be requested as well. Every single item on your payment request template has to have supporting documentation, no matter the cost. So if it's $5, there should still be an invoice and there should still be payment support. As Chase mentioned, during the PA process, we will do our review. There might be items that are missing or that we have questions on. We will send the payment request back. It's in everyone's interest to process these as quick as possible. So we ask that you're timely in your response. And as Chase mentioned, after 2 weeks, if the items have not been addressed, the PAs will be rejected and you'll have to resubmit them for consideration through a separate payment request. And then we do intend to reach out to your project management team at some point during our process. So we ask that you let your team know that this program exists, and as well as RSM's role and involvement, so that when we do reach out, your team is aware and ready and prepared to handle the requests that come through with our review. And Chase, if you go to the next slide, please. I believe I touched on most of this in the other slide. The one thing I'll reiterate or re-emphasize is that you should certainly keep documentation of how you're doing your procurement. So if you do come across a situation where it's a sole source, or you reached out to multiple vendors and you only heard back from one, we're going to expect the level of detail of who did you reach out to, when did you reach out to them, did they respond, say they weren't interested, did they respond, did they not respond at all, what other efforts did you take? So I'd say be prepared to provide that level of documentation as we're going through this process. And I believe that covers most of the things that we want to touch on. I'm not sure if I went too fast or if I skipped over anything, but happy to clarify any questions there may be.
Thank you, Megan. Here in one of our final slides for today, this is just an additional slide with links to a number of good resources for you to explore should you have questions to be addressed. And we'll close with our contact information. If you have general grant inquiries, please send those to our grants@opb.georgia.gov email address here at the office, and we can respond to those accordingly. Again, the INO-DIC program specialist is Russell O'Hairs. Unfortunately, Russell wasn't able to be with us this afternoon, but he is great to work with, and you're all lucky to have him on board as your specialist. His email address is provided here for direct contact. Should you have specific questions about audits, please utilize the Georgia ARPA@rsmus.com email address for the best and quickest answers to those audit questions. I know we've taken a good bit of your time here, but we've covered a lot of ground this afternoon. We can attempt to answer some of the questions if there are some outstanding in the chat, and anything that we cannot answer immediately, we would of course be happy to follow up on with answers or direct those conversations offline. Also, I might ask my counterpart Amanda if there's anything I have left out glaringly that you might want to speak to at this point. I know you've been keeping up with the questions through the chat as we've been presenting so far.
Yeah, we've gotten a lot of questions. Jen and myself have tried to keep up with them. Mark, I think you have a couple questions, and we want to keep this as general as possible. If you have very specific questions that are just specific to your project or your organization, we ask that you hold on to those and reach out to the grant specialist or our grants box emails for those specific ones. But if you have a general question that could apply to others, please go ahead. But Mark, go ahead with your questions.
Yeah, but this is the if you can't answer it, it's this grants@OPB that I should send them to, because they're general, but that's the specialist.
So the grants@opb.georgia.gov is our general inbox, but the grant specialist for this program is Russell.
Okay. So my two questions, and they may apply to others. So I'm with the city of Atlanta and got 3 grants awarded. We already have a job order contract that's been competed in place, and I'm sure other folks may have something similar that's called something similar. So that's already been competed, and that was part of our pricing for the work, the project, the 3 projects that we plan to do. So that is already a competed contract. So my question is, if you already have something like that, obviously we would do a detailed cost breakdown for each of the projects and a final, task order, which would have the detailed pricing. But I'm assuming that's acceptable because we're not planning to bid out our 3 projects. We already have contractors on board.
Megan?
I can answer this. Is the question, or I'll just say, regardless of whether a contractor has been procured, at the end of the day, it does have to require, or it requires compliance with 2 CFR 200. So, I don't know the intricacies of your project in particular, but it does have to comply with 2 CFR 200, regardless of whether you have already procured the contractor.
What is that? What is 2 CFR 200?
There are links within this webinar that provide some overviews and resources where you can read more on that. But if you have further questions, you can certainly reach out to our team, and Russell will be back online next week as well. So.
Okay, and you're going to send this out, this presentation. Okay, and that my final question. I got the thing to sign the terms and conditions, but in our case with the city, I believe the mayor may need to sign it, but he doesn't do electronic signatures. So someone on my team had asked whether we can download the terms and condition, have the mayor sign it, and then email it back. I know it's in like a DocuSign or Adobe Sign right now. So that was my only other question.
No, that cannot be done. I think Jen actually answered
Okay.
that question earlier. It has to be signed electronically via Adobe Sign.
Okay, that's perfect. I will let our folks know that either they might have to delegate it to Mayor Dickens or someone else will have to sign. Okay, thank you.
What other general questions do we have? Somebody has their hand up. Tara?
Oh. Where can we find the budget?
Hey, good. Oh, is there another Tara? Sorry.
Tara Buckner?
Yes. Who makes the determination of what is reimbursable?
So that would be number 1 covered under the allowable expenses under the program information on the website.
Okay.
That's going to be your first level of review for that. And then all of that's going to be included whenever you provide your detailed budget worksheet for final review. That's something that the OPB team and RSM review to make sure that everything that's listed in your final budget is allowable and is in alignment with 2 CFR 200.
Okay. So, and once we've looked at that, is it the program specialist that would be talking to us about what is reimbursable and what is not?
So your final budget goes to your program specialist for review, yes.
Okay.
If they have any questions or anything needs any revisions, they will reach out to you once they've reviewed it. And if it's going under revision, then you'll go back and forth. They'll return it to you for revisions if necessary, and you would resubmit it. But yes, that's mostly
Okay.
between you and the program specialist.
Okay. And then I have one other question. With reimbursements that follow, I understand CFR 200, the documentation that needs to be submitted that proves that the work was done and that it is reimbursement, is it invoices or paid receipts? So in the case of parks equipment, an example would be purchase and installation of a playground.
So it's going to be the, it depends on what exactly is being requested for reimbursement and the amounts.
Mhm.
It has to meet the thresholds, or it depends on the thresholds that are met within that payment request.
So the threshold that you talked about was $100,000. But for example, if the labor and the actual installation and the equipment are one contractor, we would submit the invoice to you all along with the paperwork that you just discussed.
Yeah, you will find on the detailed, on the payment request template, very detailed instructions on what documentation is appropriate and required per the budget category in which your expense falls, whether that was contracts and consultants or equipment or supplies. Each of those budget categories will have a detailed list of documents that we will need to review the payment request for approval.
Okay, and then the Davis-Bacon, the total project cost is $10 million, right? In order, if
That is true, that is if obviously this grant caps out at 2 million or 2.2 million with the contingency.
yes,
So Davis-Bacon is, it looks at the total project, cost. Or
Okay, thank you.
expected cost.
Thank you.
Clay Tracy? Did you still have a question, Clay?
Yes, sir. Quick question. So on our final budget, I was curious on if there is a deadline for getting that in. We originally got most of our estimated quotes from contractors and stuff probably August of last year. So we're well aware that those have probably changed. And if we have to go through a procurement process on some of this stuff, we know that will hopefully not change drastically, but we know it will change. And we know those prices have already gone up because we've already started kind of the process on looking at some of that stuff. So do we need to go through procurement before we turn in a final budget, or what's the timeline on that?
There is a specific timeline for the condition, as well as submitting and getting the task for your vendor management form in W-9. However, I do not believe we have a set timeline for a final budget submission. However, keep in mind that you will only be able to submit a payment request once that final budget has been submitted and approved.
I just want to chime in on that. I'm sorry. Jen had actually answered this question from somebody earlier in the chat, and the final budgets are requested within 90 days of signing of terms and conditions.
Thank you, Amanda.
I have a question on that because some of the procurement processes take more than 90 days.
So I'll jump in here real quick. The budgets don't have to be completed after procurement. A lot of them actually are completed prior to procuring. The budget should be based on the highest level of detail that you have available at the time of doing the budget. And hopefully that is enough for us to do our reasonableness analysis, but you do not have to have procurement in place before you complete your detailed budget.
Okay. Thank you.
Clay, did you have an additional question?
Sorry, no, I just didn't take it off.
Oh, that's all right. Thank you.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. Kristen just raised her hand, just in the interest of time, because we've gone so long. After Kristen, if anybody else has any other questions, if you will reach out to the grants box for now, since Russell is out of the office this week, we will make sure that your questions get answered as quickly as possible. But Kristen, go ahead.
So my question is, I'm looking at getting the budget done and putting that together, the final one, and I'm just thinking along the lines of typically when in the past when I've dealt with like contractors, let's say that they're redoing the roof of the facility, they typically just give us the bill and don't necessarily break it down, and we don't so like the cost of equipment, the cost of supplies, the cost of labor are all in one bill. So how typically would that be reimbursed, or what category would that be reimbursed in on a budget? Or would we have to require them to break it out?
Chase, would you like me to jump in?
Yeah, Megan, do you have?
Okay.
Yeah.
So the contractors won't be completed a detailed budget. You will be. So it sounds like that budget. I also believe that there might be some tutorials online or some guidance within the detailed budget that might provide you further guidance with some of these questions. But as you take a look at it, if you have questions, you can reach out to Russell or the grants inbox, and we can certainly walk you through that process.
Okay, thank you, Megan. Well, again.
Okay, again, in the interest of time, I think we're going to go ahead and end the webinar unless Chase or Megan, you guys have anything else specific?
I do
Not for me. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you guys so much for your time today. Greatly appreciate it. Again, if you have any questions that we didn't get to today, go ahead, reach out to the grants box at grants@opb.georgia.gov. And I posted the link to the program webpage in the chat, so you can check there for more information. I encourage you to review that as soon as possible. And then this webinar, the slides will be up on our website, hopefully by tomorrow. Thank you guys so much. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.